Welcome to Interfaith Food Shuttle's Seed to Supper program. This free beginning gardening course is a 6-part series that will give you the tools that you need to start a garden and to grow your own food on a budget. The class was originally created by the Oregon State Food Bank and by Oregon State University Cooperative Extension and was adapted for growing in North Carolina by Interfaith Food Shuttle staff and volunteers. For additional resources and to follow along with the course, you can download the Seed to Supper manual, which is available on our website.
So when we begin to start thinking about where we're putting our garden bed and how we're getting it started, there are 4 main elements we're considering, as well as a few other thoughts around the site itself. But our 4 key elements that all gardens and all plants need are sun, rain, air, and good healthy soil. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit more specifically through the class. What you also want to consider when selecting the site is if it's close to where you're at. It's close to you being able to access it to do work, and it's not far away, as well as it not being in what we call a problem area, where the soil itself might be a little nasty or might have some low areas that collect water. But we'll talk about that specifically in just a second. We all know that plants need good sunlight to grow and thrive. And for your garden vegetables, they need usually between 6 and 8 hours of sunlight. Some plants, like leafy greens and some herbs, can handle a little bit less sun, closer to 4 hours. But really here in North Carolina, there is no maximum amount of sunlight your plants can get. They want to have a good full day of sun to thrive and produce healthy fruits, vegetables, leaves, and roots, and all the things we're going to eat. It's also really important to remember where you place your garden in location to other things that might block the sun. So we know that the sun is in the southern sky here in North Carolina and the entire United States. And so that means when you're placing your plants that are a little bit shorter, you want to put them on the southern side of your garden so that as the taller things grow, they don't cast a shadow on the things that are a little bit shorter than them. So you'll place the shorter plants on the southern side and the taller plants on the northern side, like you see in the slide here. When we're choosing our site for our garden, we also think about soil very specifically. We'll get into soils and what makes them healthy and how we can make them healthy in class number 2. But when you're originally siting your garden, what we're looking for are areas that don't have too much moisture or too little moisture. So if you see the bare soil and it's pooling water after a heavy rain, that's not such a great site. And the opposite, if it's been really rainy and wet, but it's still really, really dry, that's also not a great spot to put your garden bed. And it doesn't make a lot of sense at first, but if you see a lot of weeds and things growing on a spot around your home and where you'd like to put your garden, that's a good sign. That means things are healthy, the soil can support plant life, even if it's not the plants that you intend to grow at the time. It's a good sign that something healthy is going to grow there. While plants need air to grow that they breathe in through their leaves to create the leaves themselves and the green shoots, we don't want to put our gardens in places that have either too much air and wind that can whip the leaves around, but we also don't want the air to be completely still and stagnant. Here in North Carolina, where it's very hot and humid, that can be an issue and cause problems to the health of your plant. Another element all plants need to thrive is water. In North Carolina, we get a lot of rain in much of the seasons, but in all reality, in the summertime, it can cut off and we need to provide that water. So when we start to think about where to put our garden bed, we need to be mindful of where it is in relationship to the water from our home. So that means having a hose or a sprinkler or a watering can. We want to consider how close that garden is to your home so it's not too hard to get a lot of water to it. That can also mean it's close to where your tools are at, and if it's close to your home, it's an extension of your home, and it's a beautiful thing that you want to tend. So being thoughtful about where you place your garden in proximity or closeness to your home is really important. Another thing to consider when you're placing your garden bed near your home is all the other buildings that might be casting a shadow on your garden box itself. And so we know that the sun is in the southern sky, which means it casts shadows to the north. And so if you place your garden on the northern side of your home, it might not get those 4 to 8 hours of sunlight it really needs to thrive. And so if we place our garden on another side of our house where it gets all the good sunlight that it needs to thrive, that will really help your garden be successful right from the beginning. So we've talked about a lot of the different things that you want in your garden. There's a few things we need to consider that we need to either fix ourselves or just look out for. So some things are aspects of your yard itself. If it's a really low area that gets a lot of water, that sits in pools, that can be damaging to your plants and their roots. You also don't want to place your garden anywhere that has too much of a slope or an incline, like it's on a steep hill. The issue and challenge with growing on a slope is that over time, water and soil can wash away from the area, eroding your garden bed. These kind of hillsides or slopes and inclines can be flattened, but if you can't do that, it's best to avoid these areas. Another thing to consider, for those of us especially in the urban environment, is pollution in the soil. Now, most soils can be cleaned up, specifically if they have things like glass and garbage. Over time, we can clean those up and have a healthy garden. But you really want to be careful for some of those nastier chemicals that stay in the ground for a long time, things like lead paint. If you have lead paint and you're able to determine that, it's really important to build what we call a raised bed, which we'll get into in later classes, and put a barrier down so that your roots of the plants aren't getting into any of that lead or other nasty chemicals that might be present.
Once you've picked out a good garden site, it's time to start dreaming and scheming about what you're going to plant there. When you're planning out your garden, there are 5 main things that you'll want to consider. The first and most important is, what do you enjoy eating? What's realistic? What's cost effective? What do you have space for, or what are your space limitations? And fifth and finally is, how will what you grow now impact what you can grow later? The first consideration is the easiest and the most fun, which is, what do you enjoy eating? I like to start out any garden planning process by sitting down and just making a list of the things that I'm most excited to eat and I'm most excited to grow. So think about what you enjoy, think about what people in your family might enjoy eating, and also think about what you just really want to see grow. So it's not just about how we enjoy it in our cuisine, but also about enjoying what we get to see outside of our front door. Maybe there's a specific variety that you're excited to grow. Maybe there's a vegetable that your grandmother or your grandfather used to grow in their garden that you want to try growing now. Maybe there's a specific food that you really like to eat that's really hard to find at the local grocery store. Growing your own garden can give you access to vegetables that you might not be able to find otherwise. So in making your list of things that you're excited to grow, think about all of these considerations. And for right now, don't worry about limiting it to what you think will work or is realistic, but just dream really big, and then we'll start to think about what makes sense here. Once you've got your dream list, it's time to start thinking about what actually makes sense to grow in this time and place. Here in North Carolina, we've got long, hot summers and cool, mild winters, so we can actually grow year-round here, and there's a wide variety of vegetables that we can grow in our climate. Of those vegetables, there's 2 main categories to think about. One is cool season crops like lettuce, collards, kale, beets, carrots. The other is warm season crops, which includes things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. Cool season crops can be grown in North Carolina in the spring and the fall and even in the winter. All of the cool season crops can tolerate some amount of cold, even dipping below 32 degrees, which is the frost point. Some of them are more cold tolerant than others, so it's important to look into the different crops and understand that when deciding exactly what you want to plant, but all of them can withstand some amount of hard cold like that. On the flip side, the warm season crops like the tomatoes and peppers, they won't stand any cold and they won't stand any frost, so anything dropping below 32 degrees. So those plants can only be planted after the last frost in the spring and before the first frost in the fall. So in this part of North Carolina, that's going to mean planting those sometime in mid-April. And making sure that you have enough time for them to come to full harvest before the end of October. At the end of Chapter 1 in your Seed to Supper manual, there's a North Carolina common crop chart, which will show you the cool season crops that grow well here and the warm season crops that grow well here. So that's a great place to look if you're trying to figure out what you can grow and what time of year to grow it. Growing a garden can give you affordable access to the freshest vegetables, but some crops are going to be more cost-effective to grow than others. If you look in Chapter 1 in the Seed to Supper manual, there's a chart that shows you the relative value of different common garden vegetables. And you'll see on there that there's some things like herbs and smaller leafy greens and tomatoes that have really high value. They cost more at the grocery store, but they can be relatively quick and easy to grow, or in the case of tomatoes, they're just really productive. On the other hand, there's other crops that are noted as lower value, and that's because they take up a lot of space in the garden. Some of them take up a lot of time in the garden, and they're relatively cheap to get at the grocery store. So this is an important thing to consider, especially if you're growing your garden as a way to have more affordable access to fresh produce. But if there's something that you're really excited to grow, even if it's low value, you can still go ahead and do it, because part of growing a garden is about the joy that you get from it as well. Another thing to consider in planning out your garden is space limitations. Plants need a certain amount of sunlight and air, their roots need access to a certain amount of water and nutrients, and the size of the plant is going to dictate how much space it needs. It can be really tempting, especially in an urban setting where we're oftentimes limited to smaller spaces, to try and squeeze in as many plants as possible, thinking that we'll get more harvest from that. But really, you're going to ultimately cut down on your harvest if you put your plants closer together than they ideally want to be. So one really important thing to think about in planning out your garden is the footprint of the plant, or how much space it will take up and how much space it needs to grow healthy and strong. If you look at the common crop chart at the end of Chapter 1, one of the pieces of information you'll find there is the footprint of each of those common crops. So that's a really important thing to reference as you're starting to plan out how much you're going to plant of any one thing and where it will go in the garden. A lot of people really like corn and watermelon and pumpkins, but those things take up a lot of space in the garden. So unless you have a really big space to grow, you probably want to avoid things like that take up a lot of space and produce relatively little for the space that they take up. In comparison, things like kale, chard, lettuce, carrots, beets, those things take up relatively little space, and you can get a lot more from them. Other things like tomatoes have a relatively big footprint. Tomatoes take up about 2 square feet, but they produce a lot. So it can still be worthwhile to grow things that have a big footprint as long as they're very productive. One common method that's used in planning out a garden when you're using a small space is what's called the square foot garden planning method, which basically means dividing your garden by square feet and then looking at the footprint of those crops and figuring out how many you could fit within each of those square feet, and using that as a point of reference for figuring out what you can fit in and how much you can grow of any one thing. Another thing to consider in thinking about space is not just the width of the vegetables, but also the height of the vegetables. Some plants are going to be a lot taller than others, and as we referenced earlier when thinking about planning out your site, you want to think about the sun and make sure that when you're planting those taller vegetables, you're planting them towards the northern side of the bed so they're not shading out your smaller plants. The last thing to consider when planning out your garden is how what you plant now will impact what you can plant later. For many of us growing in an urban environment, we oftentimes are limited in space. So we really want to try and maximize the amount of produce we can get out of our garden by growing multiple crops in the same space over the course of the year. This is called succession planting, when in one part of our garden we plant multiple crops over the course of the season. So for example, you might plant radishes in the spring, and then in that same place where the radishes were, once you pull them out, you might plant tomatoes in the summer, and then follow those up perhaps with some spinach in the fall after the tomatoes are done. This way you get 3 different crops from that one part of your garden. Another version of succession planting is when you plant one crop multiple times over the course of a season in order to have a continuous harvest of that crop. There are some things like lettuce, radishes, carrots that are going to be ready to harvest all about at the same time. And so you would be able to harvest those for about 2, maybe maximum 3 weeks, and then they'd be done. If you want to be able to harvest them over a longer period of time, then you'll want to plant them multiple times, maybe spaced about 2 or 3 weeks apart, in order to be able to harvest them over the course of their season. When we're thinking about what to grow this year, we also want to consider what we've grown in the year prior and what we plan on growing in future years. Vegetables can be divided into roughly 9 different plant families. For example, cabbage, kale, broccoli, all of these are in the Brassica family, whereas peppers, tomatoes, eggplants are in the nightshade or the Solanaceous family. And when we're thinking about planning out our garden, we want to think about rotating our crops around so that we're not growing one family in the same space year after year after year. The reason we do this is because those families oftentimes struggle with the same sorts of pests and disease issues and use the same sorts of nutrients from the soil. So we want to mix these up in order to maintain the overall health of our soil, which will maintain the overall health of our plants.
So now that we've covered all the material in Chapter 1, we're going to bring it together with an activity so that you can really begin to think out all those important things about how to plant your garden. So with the booklet you've got or you've downloaded, we're going to turn to the personal planting plan in the very back of Chapter 1. So thinking about the things that we started with, the things your family likes to eat and grow, things that are important to your cuisine, thinking about what's reasonable in North Carolina, and all those other considerations. That's all going to come together in this planting plan that's going to guide what you want to grow in your own garden bed. So starting at the very beginning with the crop itself, you're going to list out all the crops that you're hoping to grow that make sense. And from there, you're going to fill out each column according to either the common crop chart that's in this booklet or the information on the seed packet or other sources you can find online or in books to make sure that you have a really good sense of what kind of needs there are for this plant in terms of its space, the timing, when you want to harvest, and other things like that. After you've filled out your personal planting plan, flip the booklet over or pull out a piece of paper to make your own personal planting map. So from here, we're going to take all those components of the site that we discussed, things like the location of buildings and water, and draw it on the map. So you should place anything that you will think is important that will influence your garden itself. Tall buildings, the directions, where the water's coming from, and anything else, maybe those low and high points in the soil, are all really important to draw and sketch. And once you have that all laid out for your garden itself, place your garden where you think it should go, where that best spot is to get all the sun, air, water, and healthy soil that it needs to thrive. Now that you have the site chosen on your landscape, the next thing you want to do is actually draw what's going to go in the garden bed itself. Again, in the booklet, flip it over. We have one more page to go that you can use for a grid to sketch out what garden plants you want in here. So from here, you want to keep it at scale. So if every block maybe counts for 1 foot or 1.5 feet or half a foot, use that to guide how big the space should be according to how much space you have. This can be helpful when we plan out the footprint of the plant. So if I know that each block represents 1 foot by 1 foot, if I have a tomato plant, that's going to take up about 2 blocks by 2 blocks. From here, we can really see how close together can plants be, how far apart should they be so that they get that proper amount of sunlight, so they don't compete for soil nutrients and water, and they don't shade each other out. From here, once you have that sketched out, think about how you might have a different garden plan for the summer, for the fall, for the winter even, and you can draw out multiple versions of this garden bed itself, specifically for those warm and cool season crops we talked about in the common crop chart.